If you aren't a radio aficionado or a 1920s superfan, you probably aren't familiar with the National Defense Test radio broadcast from 1924. It's one of the oldest radio-related recordings, and it's not super well known, I think, so I thought I would make a video talking about it. And what's more impressive is that it was broadcast at a time before radio networks had appeared, and even gives us an idea of what a radio network prototype was like. But more on that later. So what exactly is this recording? Well, first, let's take a look at the historical context for that time. Radio as a whole was relatively new to mainstream popularity in 1924. The mainstream radio craze had really taken off in the second half of 1922, and was only continuing to get more popular across the United States. Of course, many people were attracted to the variety of entertainment they could receive free of charge, but the American government, and especially governments in other countries, saw the practical possibilities of radio. It was now much easier for leaders to directly address the people very quickly, a vast improvement over distributing printed media in terms of speed. You couldn't get much faster than instantaneous. What makes the National Defense Test recording pretty unique is that it was broadcast coast to coast. This might not seem like much of an achievement today, but keep in mind that this was at a time before even radio networks existed. It wasn't until 1926 that NBC, the first radio network in the US, was created. In radio's early days, a radio station could broadcast within a certain radius, but that was all. Although that range could be surprisingly large, and some amateurs could sometimes pick up radio signals from other countries. So, without radio networks, how was this coast-to-coast broadcast even possible? It involved a practice called station linking. That means exactly what it sounds like, linking one station to another, and so on and so on. In preparation for this broadcast, more than a dozen stations across the country were linked. It wasn't a simple process, but the successful coast-to-coast broadcast of the National Defense Test was a useful and practical technical experiment, and this station linking was a crucial step toward the development of radio networks. But the ability to link radio stations was not strictly for commercial purposes. This was only a handful of years after the utter devastation of World War I. The world was kind of still in chaos from that fallout, and communication would be critical in the event of another war. While the United States had been spared the physical scarring that had plagued the landscapes of Europe, it was not crazy to think that the US could experience a future attack on its own soil, given the simultaneous and international rise of far-right and far-left groups, and the political chaos that was still running rampant through much of the world at that time. And the early 1920s had already seen some scattered terrorist attacks in the US, most notably the Wall Street bombing in 1920 that killed 40 people. But that was more of an isolated attack. If a well-organized radical group staged a coup or something, that could be far more damaging, even though an attack on that scale was pretty unlikely. And the US government was leery of such violence in Europe, such as the recent Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War in Russia, and the recent Revolution and Civil War in Ireland, among others. And that brings us to the entire purpose of this broadcast. We don't celebrate National Defense Day today, of course, but in 1924 it was intended as a day for patriotism and preparedness, both of which would be necessary in the event of another world war. Modern war had begun, and that meant total war. If a war were to break out, not only the military would have to be mobilized, but everyday citizens would also need to be mobilized for arms production and other war-specific jobs. Time magazine described the purpose behind National Defense Day like this. The idea was that, inasmuch as our regular army is small, 1/6 of the nation's theoretical military strength, it would be well to have a test in which the auxiliary forces, National Guard, and reserves should assemble and go through the first steps of mobilization which would be undertaken in time of war. But not everyone was on board with the idea of a National Defense Day, however. Some saw it as gearing up the country for war instead of simply preparing for a war. 4 governors voiced their displeasure and protested against it, as well as pacifist groups. Perhaps the most prominent of these detractors was John W. Davis, who at the time was the Democratic nominee for the 1924 presidential election. On Defense Day, he made a speech criticizing it, saying, "We will make poor use also of this day and the lessons that it teaches if we think only in terms of national defense and preparedness for war. It is more important that we should prepare for peace. Surely we have as much of vision, of effort, and of courage to contribute to the prevention of war as to its successful conduct when it comes. A pacifist organization also protested the celebration in an article, saying, "It is the familiar story. General Pershing has been building up in this country silently and almost unobserved a vast military machine. He is supposed by his subordinates to be itching to see how it will work." In the broadcast itself, the first speech, given by Major General Charles McKinley Saltzman, addressed these protests and insisted that Defense Day was not a mobilization, but more like a nationwide inspection of the military. And General Pershing himself agreed with that assessment in the recording. All in all, the New York Times reported that the day was observed in 6,535 localities, and 16,792,781 persons took part, it is estimated. This total did not include the millions that witnessed the parades and demonstrations forming a part of the test. Now, with all of that context out of the way, let's finally look at the broadcast itself. The full surviving portion of the recording runs just short of an hour and a half. It was really designed as an endpoint for National Defense Day. The parades had all occurred throughout the country earlier in that day. The recording was made in the War Department building in Washington, D.C. The first speaker in the recording was Secretary of War John W. Weeks, who acted as the host of sorts of the whole program. And there were two other main speakers. The most important of all the speakers was undeniably General John J. Pershing, who had commanded the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, and as such, he was one of the most famous public figures in America at the time, even nearly 6 years after the war ended. But what is perhaps most interesting about Pershing's part in all of this is that this speech acted as his official final farewell before he formally retired from the military, and quite a bit of time is spent by the other speakers in praising his achievements and character. The first speech, given by Major General Charles McKinley Saltzman, pretty much does just that, and he also explained National Defense Day in general. As previously mentioned, Pershing, like Saltzman, addressed the detractors of Defense Day, saying that they misunderstood its purpose. In his words, there is no war cloud on the horizon, so far as we can discern, but storms often appear out of a clear sky, and then it may be too late to prepare. Pershing's speech is really more of the same as Saltzman's speech, but coming from a far more famous man. After Pershing's speech, we hear another speech from John J. Carty, who was apparently given the rank of Brigadier General just for the broadcast, but was actually the head engineer at AT&T. After his speech, he quickly connected with the telephone offices of various other cities around the country to demonstrate this technological achievement. With Carty's help, Pershing then used a telephone hookup and connected to 4 other generals around the country, in San Francisco, Omaha, Chicago, and New York, and listeners could hear the two-way conversations. The thing about these speeches and conversations, though, is that the government and military officials wholly lacked radio charisma. Their speeches are slow and dry, and 3 of the 4 phone conversations are similar, though they sound a bit less scripted than the speeches. For this video, I listened to the entire broadcast, and it's not the most riveting thing to listen to, and that's putting it lightly. Just imagine you're at your radio on September 12, 1924, listening to a bunch of old men making very scripted speeches for the first 30 minutes about the importance of preparedness for a war that might not even affect you or your country or come at all. Members of the younger jazz generation would probably have rather switched to the Ever-Ready Hour. I mean, the singer Wendell Hall got married live on the air on that program only a few months earlier. Wouldn't that be more interesting? The National Defense Test broadcast certainly has great historical importance, but for entertainment value, it has nearly none. But there is a somewhat entertaining discussion between General Pershing and General Robert L. Bullard, who actually did have some radio charisma. And the tone of their conversation is very casual, so it almost feels like you're listening to a random phone conversation in 1924. In fact, since it's the highlight of the broadcast, let's just take a listen to it, shall we?
Hello, General Bullard.
Hello, General Pershing. Glad to hear you, sir.
I'm very glad to hear your voice again, but please don't sing again this evening.
Well, look here.
Well, the secretary is here, and you know we can't indulge in these such conversations as we conducted the other night while he's present.
Well, if you sing that song that you sang when you were a plebe, why, I'll admit voice that part myself. You remember? You remember it, don't you?
I remember it, but I declined to sing for you tonight.
Well, I'll put you on the tune. How's that?
No.
Faint heart never hardly ever won fair lady.
No, I never knew that song.
You did know it. I've heard you sing it. I've hazed you at it.
No, it must have been some other plebe, General.
No, I looked at your back the other night when you were making a speech, and I recognized it as the same back that I used to jump on to when you stood as a plebe in the ranks.
Well, I've never quite forgiven you for your roughness during those days.
Well, you've evened up in the long run.
So, maybe most of the speakers were boring, but imagine it in this way. You're sitting in your living room listening to top military generals talk to each other as if they're in the room with you. But there's also more to it than that. Remember when I said Mr. Carty had connected to a dozen other cities by radio? As uninteresting as it might be to listen to, it was a big leap in progress.
I will now begin to call up the different points, and I will start at New York. I will call first New York.
New York, telephone office.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Harrisburg, telephone office.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh, telephone office.
Beaver Dam, Ohio.
Beaver Dam, telephone office.
Chicago.
Chicago, telephone office.
Davenport, Iowa.
Davenport, telephone office.
Omaha, Nebraska.
Omaha, telephone office.
North Platte, Nebraska.
North Platte, telephone office.
Denver, Colorado.
Denver, telephone office.
Rawlins, Wyoming.
Rawlins, telephone office.
Salt Lake City, Utah.
Salt Lake City, telephone office.
Winnemucca, Nevada.
Winnemucca, telephone office.
Sacramento, California.
Sacramento, telephone office.
San Francisco, California.
San Francisco, telephone office.
One after another, without delay, this man was talking to people from all over the country and broadcasting it by radio, listing off cities like he was doing a national roll call. It's hard to put ourselves in that position now, with all of our instant connectivity, but that was huge in 1924. And that was the magic of radio in the 1920s. It could seemingly do anything. It's impossible to know how many people actually listened to the National Defense Test broadcast. Of course, many radio enthusiasts probably tuned in just for the novelty of it all as an important step in the advancement of the medium. And perhaps those who were concerned about the next world war that might come at any time might have wanted to know what they should do if that happened. But the sheer excitement from the idea of this broadcast at this early stage in radio might have been enough for many average people to want to tune in, at least at first. At that time, it didn't necessarily matter if the program was entertaining. The fact that any of this was actually possible was entertaining in itself for many people. Of course, that would quickly change, but my mind certainly would have been blown if I had listened to this in 1924. The technical achievement did not go unnoticed by those who had put it all together, and towards the end of the recording, it is addressed.
Such an achievement in communication had never before been attempted in the history of the world. It shows the availability of a great communication system to meet any great emergency. It has been an epoch-making event in the history of communication.
And that's pretty much it. The National Defense Test broadcast of 1924 is not a riveting listen, but it can help put you there in the moment at an important time for radio, when the possibilities of the medium seemed unlimited and was taking America by storm. I've been interested in making this video for a long time, but I didn't think it would prove to be very popular, but I have been proven wrong before about that kind of thing. And besides, I don't think there's another video explaining the National Defense Test broadcast, so I thought I would contribute something hopefully unique to YouTube. The full broadcast is freely available online, so please check it out if that's the kind of thing you like. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.